Hi, Lawrence. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Doing very well. It's midterm, so things are getting pretty busy, but I'm doing all right. How are you?
Doing well. I'm not actually teaching this semester, so I think I should be doing very well. When did you move to Chicago?
2020. 2020. I graduated during the pandemic, which was a kind of odd thing, and started a job during the pandemic. Um, but it's been interesting. It's been interesting being here. It's a very different environment from Athens, obviously. But I don't know. I enjoy it. I enjoy it.
Okay, good. Well, it's a minute after 1, so I'd like to welcome everyone to this panel is titled Public Management. Well, actually, it doesn't have a title at all. We're track 5, Public Management and Finance. And it just appears that they've decided to put 4 really interesting papers together on the same panel by making sure that we have a real spread in terms of seniority. We have a new PhD student, a couple of junior professors, and of course, somebody who's been in the profession for, well, a couple of years. There's no truth to the rumor that I took a course from Woodrow Wilson. But indeed, it's been a while. So we will go in the following order, which I communicated to the authors. We will start with the paper by Dr. Kimalee Dickerson of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her paper will be Opportunity and Opposition, the Intersectional Experiences of Black Women. That will be followed by Dr. Lawrence A. Brown II from the University of Illinois, Chicago, with his paper, The Consequences of Retirement in the Federal Civil Service, Investigating the Moderating Role of Knowledge Sharing. That will be followed by Grant Mobley, a graduate student here at American University, soon to be in our PhD program, for his paper, Expanding the Professional Agency Narrative, a cross-national examination of discretion and implications for performance. And then finally, I will present a paper with a new title. And if you wish to ask me why it doesn't deal with equity, you could do that during the question and answer session, and I can tell you embarrassing things about designing an experiment when parts of it don't work. The new title is Performance Context and Budget Cut Strategies. That was a paper co-authored by myself. I'm Ken Meier at American University, Dr. Carla Flink from American University, and Xiaoyang Xu, who is a PhD candidate at American University. I'm assuming that our guide in this, who is the co-host, will start by designating Kimalee a co-host so she might share her slides. I hope that happens because I am not a co-host and therefore I cannot share your slides. Here we go. Kimalee, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And good morning to everyone. I am here to tell you a little bit about a research study that I did recently. The title of this paper is Opportunity and Opposition, the Intersectional Experiences of Black Women Working in Government. We're going to start with a number. The number is 540,622. That is the number of Black women working full-time in U.S. state and local governments. And that represents about 10% of the workforce, the total workforce, in state and local governments. Now, those women work in a variety of positions. We have professionals, we've got technicians, service and maintenance, a range of positions, and in a range of locations. But what do we really know about them? The literature on Black women in public administration shows that Black women remain underrepresented in management and leadership positions. So although Black women are overrepresented in the public sector in general and local and state government positions, they are underrepresented in certain areas, including leadership positions. We also know that Black women face discrimination in the workplace. This has been shown to be true in both the public sector and the private sector, and relatedly perceive their work environments as less inclusive, less supportive, and less encouraging than folks from other demographic groups. And they also perceive organizations as less committed to diversity. Additionally, there is a lack of public leadership that's applying an intersectional lens and exploring the unique experiences of women of color, including Black women. So a review by Breslin and colleagues of 25 years of public administration research found that intersectionality had not been used very often to explore these particular experiences. And because of that, scholars have called for an increased use in intersectionality. This is a quote from Bearfield, who says, "The future of social equity research lies in questions that address the intersection of race and gender, as opposed to approaches that deal with them as separate categories." And intersectionality is a term coined by legal scholar Kimalee Crenshaw, which means that we're looking at the places in which different social identities overlap. So for example, looking at race, gender, and disability, rather than looking at them separately. And that allows us then to understand the unique experiences of certain groups, for example, Black women, and how that might compare to Black men or women from other demographic groups, racial demographic groups. So with that call for more research looking with an intersectional lens, that brought me to the research question for this paper, which is, how do Black women working in local and state government experience the workplace? A sub-question to that is, how do women believe that the intersection of their race and gender relate to their experiences at work? So another way to phrase this would be, what does it mean to be a Black woman working in state and local government? In terms of research design and methods, this was a qualitative case study. I conducted 7 focus group interviews virtually in the fall of 2022, so just last year. It was 38 Black women who were employed primarily by local and some state government employees in North Carolina. So all of the women were working in North Carolina. They were mostly currently employed by state and local governments. There were a few who were recently employed, meaning in the last 6 months to a year, but a few had transitioned out. They were also mostly supervisors and managers. I asked them about a number of different topics, which included their career paths, their identities, being authentic at work, some of the supports and challenges they face at work, and also we talked about self-care. In terms of analyzing the data, I used a blended inductive coding, which means I really looked at the participants' words and allowed those words to grow into theory. And I also then followed up with deductive coding, meaning I then had some specific codes in mind and went through the data utilizing those codes that were based on existing literature. Then I used also thematic analysis to bring those codes into larger themes. In terms of the findings, I want to share 2 quotes which really demonstrate what it means to be a Black woman working in local and state government. Being a Black woman in government means people are watching what I say and do. So being scrutinized, intensely scrutinized, was a theme that emerged from the data for many of the women in this study. And that watching, that scrutiny, then meant opportunity, but it also meant some opposition. And I will now talk a little bit more about what those 2 things mean, opportunity and opposition. In terms of opportunity, the participants emphasized the importance of representing their communities, which had historically been underrepresented. So being a person who was able to give voice and have a seat at the table. This is a quote that captures that idea. So Letitia says, "I have a seat at the table. I have a lot of responsibilities to carry the voice of people who look like me and who have experiences that are like mine." These are all pseudonyms for the names of the participants that I'm sharing. Additionally, that opportunity to be seen, to be watched, meant for many of these women that they were the first in the roles that they were occupying. And that meant for them that they had a responsibility to not just be the first, but to ensure that they weren't going to be the last. So to create pathways for others to come behind them. So Katrina says, "I'm the first of color, so I hold it very high. That is my responsibility to help my people and to make pathways for other people that look like me." And then lastly, many of the women recognize themselves as role models. So here Bernice says, "When people come into our office and see me as a Black woman, I want the younger generation to say, oh, that's someone that looks like me. I can do this, I can do that." So in addition to being a door knocker, as one of them called themselves, and opening doors for others, also being there as a role model to be seen, to show the possibility for other people, particularly younger generations. And in addition, that feeling of being seen and being scrutinized was associated with some opposition. So here, participants talked about facing opposition from both their colleagues and the community in several different ways. So the first quote represents scrutiny around feeling doubted and not believed or not listened to when they spoke. So here Karen says, there's a tendency to automatically have doubt when I speak, but then someone else can say the exact same thing that I said, and it's accepted. Secondly, another area of scrutiny was feeling like they were misunderstood and perceived as being abrasive. Some of the women also talked about stereotypes and not wanting their behavior to conform to stereotypes about Black women. And then the third area here is that some of the women described being tokenized by their organizations. So here, Roberta explains, you're a token for the organization every time there's a community event or there's anger from the community on a Black issue. And so that being visible also has some areas in which it doesn't feel as positive for the women. And they talked about several different ways in which they manage that opposition that they experience from being heavily scrutinized. So one way was learning how to code switch, meaning switch the language that they're using. Some even talked about using a different tone, using less bass in their voice, for example, so that certain people could then understand and hear what they were saying. Another strategy was learning to paper or cover up emotions because they didn't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. And then lastly, several of them talked about this feeling of needing to go above and beyond, to be double credentialed, as one of them said, just to get respect. And that was something that they felt other colleagues did not have to do. So in addition to experiencing this intense scrutiny, which provided both opportunity and opposition, the women talked about how that impacted them. So on one hand, in terms of positive impacts, they talked about it being rewarding and fulfilling to be the person to represent the community voice and to be the model for people to see what is possible. But on the other hand, they talked about several negative impacts, particularly for opposition, but also related to the opportunity even. And so, for example, they talked a lot about the exhaustion of being the person that had to speak up and how exhausting it was to do that all the time. They talked about the stress that they experienced because of the scrutiny that they were under. And several of them talked about health impacts from that stress and even used terms like emotional trauma. And then lastly, I thought it was notable that two of them specifically said something about the job killing them. So they used the language of, I don't want this job to kill me, and therefore I had to do these things to care for myself and to step back a little bit. So one of them is actually on FMLA leave because of the stress she had been under. So I just want to highlight a few implications and conclusions from this study. First, the findings really relate to well-being. And we know that organizations benefit when their employees are doing well and have high levels of well-being. They take less sick days, they're more productive. We also know that since the pandemic, government workers have experienced higher levels of burnout than public sector workers. And so related to my study specifically and what Black women experience, I've helped to identify that this scrutiny that they feel like they're under, this feeling of being watched, is a unique source of stress for Black women. And while it's associated with both opportunity, that can be stressful, and the opposition is also stressful. Second is recruitment and retention. So it's a recent challenge, and particularly in the public sector, of being able to recruit and retain employees. And these findings help to highlight that opportunity can be a motivator for these women to enter into the public sector and to stay. So a lot of them talked about feeling rewarded, feeling fulfilled, feeling empowered because of the opportunity to be a role model, to be a door knocker, to be in the room where it happens for Hamilton fans. But on the other hand, opposition that they experienced was a factor in some of them leaving the positions that they previously held, or wanting to leave and considering leaving even if they were still there. And then the findings also relate to positive climate and culture. So more local governments are striving to create inclusive work environments. This has become a more common topic in the last few years. And my findings help to highlight that culture change is really needed so Black women can be heard and valued in local government and state government workplaces. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering questions.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Dickerson. A very interesting study. We will come back for a whole set of questions at the end. We will now move to Dr. Lawrence Brown and consequences of retirements in the federal civil service, investigating the moderating role of knowledge sharing. Dr. Brown? You are on mute.
All right, let's see. I will I'll stop share real quick. I'm working with two monitors and kind of have to shift things around a little bit. There we go. All right, so hey everybody, my name is Lawrence Brown. I am an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and this is the consequences of retirements in the federal civil service, investigating the moderating role of knowledge sharing. So as many of you know, right, scholars have called on politicians and public managers for a very long time. I think the earliest study I cite here is in 2000, but I think you could find stuff going back to the 80s, right? Calling on politicians and public managers to take the aging of the public workforce more seriously, right? The idea is that the public workforce is getting much older, and as they continue to get older, right, a retirement wave is going to occur, right? And this retirement wave will wipe out agency operating capacity. As you see in this table here, the percentage of federal civilian employees who are at or above retirement age or getting to retirement age at age 60 has been increasing over the past few decades, going from 8.77% in 2006 to 14.85% in 2021. Though we haven't seen this much caution retirement wave happening yet, it's just kind of a fact that employees have to leave the workforce eventually. And so we have to be ready for that, right? We have to be ready for the incredibly important job-specific and agency-specific knowledge that these employees have eventually leaving organizations. One way that agencies are addressing this possible knowledge loss is through promoting knowledge sharing, right? Knowledge sharing has been defined by different scholars in different ways over the years. Argrove and Ingram call it the process through which one unit is affected by the experience of another. Ipe calls it the process by which knowledge held by an individual is converted into a form that can be understood, absorbed, and used by other individuals. And Conway and Kellaway call it a set of behaviors that involve the exchange of information or assistance to others. Agencies encourage knowledge sharing through a number of different avenues, right? Since the 1990s, agencies have operated knowledge banks and knowledge repositories and knowledge libraries where people can just enter important job-related knowledge into a server somewhere, right? A mentorship is another important method of knowledge sharing. This can be formal or informal, right? Some organizations structure their goals and work processes in order to intentionally create a social ecology that promotes collaboration and disincentivizes knowledge hoarding, which we'll get to in probably the next slide. And there's a ton of research on rewards that promote knowledge sharing, incentives, right? These studies are a bit mixed on whether or not these rewards and incentives really work, but there's a lot of it, and so I kind of have to tip my hat to it. These techniques and others create what Connolly and Kellaway call knowledge sharing cultures, which I define as when sharing of job-related knowledge among employees exists as a cultural norm within an organization. Then you might say, hey, knowledge sharing sounds like a pretty basic thing. Doesn't it happen in every organization? It happens to some extent in every organization, but there are definitely barriers to knowledge sharing that make it more less likely to occur. There's competitive knowledge hoarding, which usually occurs when an individual in an organization believes that knowledge sharing will lead to a loss in their personal power, their personal clout, or their competitive edge within an organization. This is more likely to happen in organizations with significant power differentials and with strong hierarchies. This also happens in organizations with low levels of interpersonal trust, right, where people just don't trust each other, so they don't talk to each other as much. People are also obviously less likely to share knowledge in workplaces where employees have distant or tenuous personal relationships, where people just aren't very close. The benefits of knowledge sharing are pretty long. There's a pretty long list here. For one, it improves creativity among and innovation among employees. 2, it can increase job satisfaction. 3, it can even improve the performance of the person sharing the knowledge. 4, it increases the competitive advantage in studies looking at the private sector, right? So knowledge sharing has organization-wide benefits in some cases. And at present, however, there is no research, at least that I've been able to find, investigating the influence of knowledge sharing when retirements lead potentially to knowledge loss in organizations. So the present research basically posits that 1, federal employees who are eligible for retirement are more likely to have incredibly important agency-specific, program-specific, or policy-specific knowledge. 2, that the loss of these employees via retirement will damage subsequent perceptions of work unit skill improvement, which I kind of have to word in that way, even though it's a bit awkward because of the survey item that I kind of have to work with here. My first hypothesis is that retirements in federal sub-agencies are negatively associated with perceptions of work unit skill improvement the following year. So when retirements occur in an agency, people are less, or more retirements occur in an agency, people are less likely to feel like work unit skill is improving in their agency. Second hypothesis is that the prominence of knowledge sharing in federal sub-agencies will reduce the negative impact of retirements on next year improvements in work unit skill. So in agencies where knowledge sharing is a bit more common, is a bit more robust, people in the agency are less likely to feel like retirements are damaging the skill level in their overall work unit. And hypothesis 3, I look at 2 different types of retirements. One is voluntary retirements, which are basically standard retirements. These are retirements at standard federal age and service requirements. And I'm also looking at early retirements, which are retirements at reduced federal age and service requirements, right? So I basically posit that voluntary retirements will have a greater negative relationship with perceptions of skill improvement than early retirements, because people who voluntarily retire have been serving longer and probably have more agency and program specific knowledge. My data sources are OPM's FedScope, which is a massive repository of personnel information operated by the Office of Personnel Management. And I also use the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, which is the yearly survey that goes out to a number of federal agencies each year. Something I'm very proud of because I worked on it for a very long time. I was able to combine these 2 data sets. It takes a very long time and is very difficult because agency codes and agency identifiers that would typically make it easy to match agencies across these data sets differ and change over time. It's a whole mess, but I was able to match these 2. I look at 199 unique federal sub-agencies organized into panels ranging from 2010 to 2019. So my dependent variable is the improvement in work unit skill measured by the survey item. The skill level in my work unit has improved in the past year. This is, of course, a Likert scale item, and this variable is measured as the percentage of respondents in each sub-agency that are strongly agree and agree. My independent variables of primary interest. Number 1 is the retirement rate, right, which is measured as the number of retirements in a federal sub-agency in a given year over the total number of employees at a sub-agency in a given year. And I look at a few different types of retirements again, all retirements, and then I also look at the subsets of early retirements and voluntary retirements in different models. And another major independent variable is a measure of knowledge sharing culture. It's a composite score made up of different federal employee viewpoint survey items. One is employees in my work unit share job knowledge with each other. Two is my supervisor and team leader provides me with constructive suggestions to improve my job performance. Three, managers promote communication among different work units. And four is how satisfied are you with the information that you receive from management on what is going on in your organization. And I interact these two to get a sense of whether different levels of knowledge sharing in an organization affect how retirements impact how people feel about their work unit skill. I have a pretty long list of control variables. I've got these FEV survey items here. I think we're running pretty close to time, so I'm not going to go into detail on any of these, but here they are. These are all composite scores made out of FEV survey data. I also have a number of control variables coming from FedScope. There's demographic variables. There's variables related to different types of turnover, transfer out, and disciplinary removal rate, which have been found to be associated with agency performance. I also have variables looking at employees coming into the organization, because of course, new hires are going to have an impact on skill improvement in a work unit. I also have a variable looking at organizational size, and I include year fixed effects as well. So, in the first model, we have no interactions, right? In the second model, we're interacting retirements and knowledge sharing culture. There's the formula there. I'll kind of go past this one because I think this is this figure is much more illustrative of what I'm sort of talking about here. You see here at the lowest levels of knowledge sharing, this kind of funky dotted dash line here, perceptions of skill improvement drop off significantly as retirement rate increases, right? So in agencies where people are not talking to one another, you see a much greater impact of perceptions of skill as retirements increase, right? At mean levels of knowledge sharing, basically, in the middle and average, there's a slight drop off of perceptions of skill improvement as retirement rates increase. And at high levels of knowledge sharing, there's a pretty surprising increase in perceptions of skill improvement with retirements, right? So here, basically, as there are more retirements in an agency, you see people feeling like their work unit skill is improving, right? Which is interesting to me. Here is a table looking at the other models that I looked at. It's sort of difficult to say what's happening in this early retirement table. Not as many variables or coefficients were significant, but in the model looking at voluntary retirements, we see a generally more intense impact of voluntary retirements than retirements as a whole. So my findings in sum, right? In the all retirements model, the interaction of retirement rate and knowledge sharing was positively associated with work unit skill improvement. At the lowest and mean levels of knowledge sharing, perceptions of skill improvement in these sub-agencies decrease with the previous year's retirement rate. So as there are more retirements, people feel less likely that their work unit skill is improving. And this is most pronounced at the lowest levels, right? So when you have less knowledge sharing in an agency, things are worse for organizations. And at the highest levels of knowledge sharing, perceptions of skill improvement increase with retirement rate, right? So you could say that retirements are a good thing, at least in my model here. And I don't really understand the mechanism at work here. I think future research can maybe probe that. Next, early retirements don't seem to have an impact on the perceptions of work unit skill improvement when interacting with knowledge sharing. And an increase in the voluntary retirement rate seems to have a stronger impact on perceptions of work unit skill than an increase in the category of all retirements. So I think that this research is important because, for one, on public sector knowledge sharing. Two, I think it adds to the literature on the performance impacts of turnover. Three, scholarly research on public sector retirements is pretty rare these days. There's not a ton of stuff being published in that realm, despite the fact that retirements are going to be increasingly important over the next few years. And lastly, empirical research on the impact of employee retirements on variables related to public sector agency performance is very rare, right? Like I said, I haven't been able to find anything on this stuff. So I think that this paper is really important for that. So future direction for research. Knowledge sharing is a social activity that is likely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to know, what are the implications of employee skill and agency for employee skill and agency performance there. Also, at the highest levels of knowledge sharing, work unit skill improvement has increased with retirements, right? So again, when knowledge sharing is high, there seems to be a benefit to retirements. What kind of mechanism might be at work there? I'm really interested in that. Next, the FEV survey item that I use as a dependent variable measures perceptions of work unit skill improvement, and it's worded in that very specific way. So I can't really say very much about the impact of retirements on work unit skill decline. So a lot of the stuff that I have to say, if I'm being as accurate as possible, is going to sound pretty awkward. And so I kind of hope that additional research could investigate possible decline when work retirements occur. For practice, it's incredibly important for agencies to adapt to future demographic and retirement trends. And the sharing of knowledge between more experienced and less experienced employees is one tool that managers have at their disposal. And that's all I have for you all today. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for a nice, very concise presentation. We will move on to a presentation by Mr. Grant Mobley on expanding professional agency narrative and cross-national examination of discretion and implications for performance. Grant, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So give me 1 second. I'll share my screen. And so, good morning, everyone. My name is Grant Mobley. I am currently a graduate student at American University. And in the fall, I will be transitioning into the PhD program here at American University. So the paper that I'm talking about today, as Professor Meier mentioned, is titled Expanding the Professional Agency Narrative Across National Examination of Discretion and Implications for Performance. And to start off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation for this paper. And it really kind of revolves around the importance the discretion plays in the implementation of policies as far as bureaucrats are concerned. Right? So bureaucrats, we know, are a vital part of the policy process. One reason why is that their expert status gives them the power to shape policies in ways often unintended by policymakers, right? That can be either good or bad. Some bureaucrats have more professional training than others. And so professional training could lead bureaucrats to use the discretion they possess in different ways. When discretion is often talked about in the public administration literature, it really kind of falls into two main strands of research. The first is the state agent narrative. And as you all know, this kind of gets at the idea that discretion is a means to pursue state goals in personally advantageous ways, right? Some of the ways that, subscribers to this narrative of discretion talk about is that, bureaucrats use this as a way to make their work safer, to make their work easier, or to make their work more rewarding. The citizen agent narrative is kind of the opposite of that. And in this kind of strand of research, it is often talked about as discretion being used to address the needs of the clients deemed deserving. It's almost a way of sorting clients who deserves, the policies implemented in ways that benefit them, as opposed to who does not. And this occurs even if it makes the job harder, less enjoyable, more dangerous, and less successful by official standards of performance. More recent research has proposed a somewhat of a middle ground between these two narratives of discretion. And it's called the professional agency narrative by Sacchini and Harrod. And they talk about it, again, as being a balanced middle between the traditional competing narratives of discretion. It seeks to describe the role of professional and educational-based knowledge in the daily decision-making of bureaucrats, and it emphasizes problem-solving and the use of knowledge on what works. This obviously has implications for organizational performance, right? The idea that focusing on what works should lead to better outcomes in theory. And so then the question becomes, well, how? And so in exploring this further, I have put here two main research questions for this paper. The first is the discretionary power wielded by street-level bureaucrats characterized by the professional agency narrative? And the second, if so, can the association between knowledge-based discretionary decision-making and organizational performance be generalized across country? And so in answering these questions, I utilized data from the 2015 Program for International Student Assessment, and I have data from 18 countries. And the context of this study is 8th grade education. So the question then becomes, well, why street-level bureaucrats and why teachers? I chose street-level bureaucrats because discretion is inherent in street-level work. A lot of what street-level bureaucrats deal with involves the use of discretionary decision-making power. Street-level bureaucrats are uniquely positioned to utilize this discretion in ways that benefits themselves, their clients, or the policy itself. And for specifically getting into why teachers use of discretion is heavily influenced by professional training, right? So in most countries, teachers are required to have at least an undergraduate education. In some countries, teachers are required to have advanced degrees, whether that be master's or even doctorates in some rare instances. And so the high degree, and in addition, the high degree of collaboration and ongoing professional development provides, I think, an opportunity for teachers to utilize discretion in ways that could help them improve their teaching, which we could then see to possibly have impacts for the ways that their curriculum is implemented. So this study proceeds through two analyses. The first is a regression analysis of the effect of discretion on job satisfaction and collaboration at the teacher level. And so I have 49,962 observations. The second analysis is an analysis of school performance, and that is measured by average PISA math score. And for that, I have 45,893 observations, and that analysis is at the school level. So this is a figure that illustrates the hypothesized relationship in this study. The idea is that the amount of discretion or the more discretion that teachers have or perceive should, one, increase their job satisfaction, which could then influence school performance by really motivating them as teachers, kind of energizing them, making them better teachers through the fact that they like what they're doing and they like how they're being treated in their role. The second pathway that I propose is through collaboration. And so increased levels of discretion that teachers have or perceive, in my view, should then translate to them using that collaboration or using that discretion in ways to collaborate with others to, one, identify best practices, and then two, to implement those best practices, which could then lead to better outcomes for their students. And then, of course, discretion should and could have a direct relationship with school performance in and of itself. So some of the theoretically important independent variables, I've talked a lot about discretion, but in this study, I thought it was important to include two dimensions of discretion, right? The reason being is that we experience things in two ways. One, we experience things how they are, but we also we have perceptions of how we are experiencing things. So I included both a measure of perceived discretion and a measure of objective discretion. The measure of perceived discretion is derived from survey responses about teachers' inclusion in decision-making and being treated as professionals. The measure of objective discretion really gets at the delegation of authority. This is derived from survey responses to school administrators that quite simply asked who was responsible for what tasks within the daily functions of the school. And so among those included are student disciplinary policies, assessment policies, textbook selection, course content, and course offering. The two other theoretically important independent variables that I included are job satisfaction. And this is included in the school analysis. So this is measured at the school level, and it is an aggregate measure of teachers' job satisfaction in the individual schools. And then there's a measure for exchange and coordination for teaching, which I am referring to as collaboration. And this measure is related to teaching techniques, materials, and ideas, but the share of between teachers at specific schools. And again, this is included in the performance analysis and aggregated to the school level. I won't spend too much time talking about the control variables, but the control variables that I included kind of revolve or fall into three main categories. There's school characteristics, among them class size, student behavior, staff, and material shortage. There's individual characteristics, which kind of dive into teacher experiences, the highest level of education of the teachers at particular schools, professional satisfaction, and gender. And then country characteristics, right? So one that I include is development level. Obviously, the amount of discretion that teachers are given, or even certain outcomes when it comes to things like test scores, are going to be, greatly affected by a school's capacity or a country's capacity to provide education. So I thought that was important to include. Also included number of class periods per week required in mathematics, and country fixed effects. And so the regression results, and these results are for the first analysis, with job satisfaction and collaboration as the two dependent variables. These studies, or these regressions, were utilizing the pooled OLS method, and I estimated these regressions with and without fixed effects, country-specific fixed effects. And what I found is that perceived discretion across the board was wildly predictive or associated with these two independent variables. Objective discretion had no impact at all. And so, the implication is that it is much more important, what teachers perceive than it is what they're actually doing. So it doesn't matter, what they're responsible for in their specific school context. It just matters that they feel as though they have the professional authority to use, their knowledge to implement the curriculum in ways that they see fit. A 1 standard deviation change in the amount of discretion a teacher experience was associated with a 0.389 standard deviation change in job satisfaction, and a 0.0759 standard deviation change in collaboration. And both of these were highly significant. And the inclusion of country fixed effects did not change the coefficient estimates. So, the implication is that country specific characteristics do not play as much of a role. For the second analysis that really hits at school performance, our results can be seen in this table. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, it doesn't necessarily matter what teachers have the power and authority to do. It really just matters that they perceive that they have the authority to make those decisions. And so perceived discretion was much more significant than was objective discretion. I found that a one standard deviation change in perceived discretion translates to a negative 5.348 standard deviation, or excuse me, point decrease in PISA test scores. And this was significant. Job satisfaction was highly significant, but in the opposite direction. So a 1 standard deviation change in job satisfaction was associated with a 22.71 point increase on PISA math test score. Collaboration was insignificant. The estimate was negative 2.713. And this simply, I took this to mean that it may matter more in some country contexts than others. A couple key takeaways from these results, though. Despite the direct negative effect, discretions is still associated with at least a 17.36 point increase in school performance. And most of that comes from the indirect pathway through job satisfaction. Again, exchange and coordination for teaching, not significant. And I take that to mean that it matters in some countries and not others. And fixed effects account for significant variation due to country-specific factors. So these estimates are reported from the regression model with country fixed effects. So what I also found is that many other factors influence job satisfaction, collaboration, and performance, right? So when it comes to job satisfaction, things like having the ability to coordinate and collaborate with other teachers mattered a lot to teachers. The gender, certain genders were more likely to collaborate or to have higher job satisfaction. Experience played a major role. And then student behavior, shortage of staff, and shortage of educational materials all had a significant role, but in a negative direction, right? So teachers who were teaching at schools with significant behavioral problems amongst students, whether they had fewer resources in terms of staff or educational materials, those negatively affected job satisfaction amongst teachers. When it comes to collaboration, gender was again an important aspect. Female teachers were more likely to collaborate than were male teachers. Job satisfaction and profession satisfaction, right? So whether or not teachers liked the specific job environment that they were currently in, or whether or not that they, were very receptive and overall had a high, respect for the profession that they chose to enter. And then shortage of staff, again, also played a major role. Teachers in schools with, shortage of qualified teaching staff were less likely to collaborate with others. And then when it comes to performance, there were some other factors, of course, that played a major role, right? The number of class periods required per week in mathematics instruction, of course, was highly associated with performance on the math test. Parent education, average class size, teacher experience, and the student behavior and shortage of educational materials, again, working in the opposite direction. So a couple key takeaways from this study. The first is that studies on discretion should recognize the role professional knowledge can play in discretionary decision-making. Discretion is not always about making work easier or determining client worthiness. And as such, management strategies that clamp down on the discretion that professional bureaucrats possess can inhibit their ability to do their job and reduce performance. And then the last one is that country-specific factors, such as structural centralization, greatly influence the uses and effects of discretion. And this really kind of means that the role professional knowledge plays in discretionary decision-making and its association with performance is specific to certain contexts. So it's can't necessarily be generalized across countries. You certainly have to think about it within the specific context of the countries that you're looking at. And so I'll conclude with just a couple of next steps as far as, where do I go from here as far as this topic? Where do we go from here as far as this topic is concerned? The first is, I plan on expanding the number of countries in the sample to get a better idea of the generalizability of the underlying theory. When it comes to performance, my analysis only included about 9 countries, which is a very small and certainly not representative of all of the different types of system structures out there. Increasing that sample size and getting a look at a lot of other environments could provide significant insight into how this theory actually works and can be applied. Exploring the time order of variables, I put up a graphic of my hypothesized relationship of it, but it could be the case that these concepts are associated or work in different orders. And so kind of exploring how time order changes the effects that these concepts can have is certainly something worth investigating. The role of structural centralization. So we saw, in the results for the performance analysis that country specific characteristics play a major role in predicting performance. And so understanding how structural centralization kind of comes into play can help to further, provide insight into, again, these theories and how they can be applied elsewhere. And then, lastly, how else might professional knowledge come into play? It could be that professional knowledge, helps and certainly allows bureaucrats to utilize discretion in more positive ways by identifying, best case scenarios, best practices, and implementing them in ways that benefits their clients. But it also can come into play in other ways. And so exploring and researching how professional knowledge kind of interacts with discretion is certainly a viable next step. And that is it. And so thank you all. I will turn it back over to Professor Meier.
Thank you, Grant. And if the moderator will let me share my screen. Share screen. And nope. I would be the one that just doesn't have this all together. So hang on a minute while I get this all figured out.
Dr. Meier, can I be of an assistance? Are you having trouble sharing the screen?
Well, just a second. Let me, oops.
Okay, there you go. Looks like you're sharing your main desktop.
Yep, and that's not, so I want a new share, right?
Yeah, so you just want to click
share.
on the stop share and then reshare just the PowerPoint open. It was already open.
Okay, stop share and reshare. Okay, and the reshare would be here, and this will work, correct?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so it would, of course, be the moderator that is the worst at doing this. So this paper, Performance Contracts and Budget Cut Strategies, the Public Response, is co-authored by Xiaoyang, a PhD student here, and Carla Flink, one of my colleagues, and actually the expert on public budgeting. I've always found the cutback management literature a little bit disconcerting because the literature has always focused on short-term strategies. How do you sort of cover up for the sort of limitations that exist in terms of the budget shortfall itself, rather than focusing on sort of major decisions that could reshape it as a result of it? And I'm going to start with kind of an illustration of how that might differ. Several years ago, when I was at Texas A&M, the state legislature cut our budget by 5%. At a school like Texas A&M, that's not a big deal. We only get 20% of the money from the state in the first place. So, you know, it's one of the things we could cover by the basically annoying things one does during a budget cut, by cutting back on maintenance and things of that nature. The president of the university at the time, Robert Gates, said, no, this is an opportunity to actually make some real decisions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take 400 positions, faculty positions from departments not doing very well, and move them to departments that are doing very well. And then I'm going to add another 400 positions also to the departments that are performing well. And I'm going to go out and raise $1 billion to support this. And this will happen in August. I've appointed a faculty committee, and if the committee is not ready to move in August, I'm going to move without them. Robert Gates did all of those things, except he didn't raise $1 billion. He raised 1.4 billion. And as part of this, he also created what was the largest graduate student diversity program, fully funding 100 fellowships across the university in perpetuity. So sometimes budget cuts can have major strategic implications. Unfortunately, I won't talk about that here. This is a replication and an extension of a work by Carla Flink and Xiaoyang on cutback management strategies and citizen evaluations of government. It's an internet vignette study of public support for cutback strategies in general purpose local governments, regular cities. And what they found was that in terms of the various strategies, that first, the most negatively evaluated, these are regression coefficients, which are standardized, and I'm just doing it for the rank order. The thing citizens don't want is they don't want you to raise taxes. The next least favorite thing is cutting personnel. they're quite capable or quite willing to let you cut capital and infrastructure or to delay infrastructure improvements or capital expenditures. And for the most part, they'd like you to take it out of the contracting you do with outsiders and whatever materials you're getting. The sort of annoying little things like you're not going to replace computers, or you're not going to be able to contract for some of the services that you normally would have. So we're going to replicate and extend this in 3 ways. First, we're going to apply it to school districts rather than general purpose local governments. The idea being that school districts are probably thought of in the public's eyes as more important than local governments. They actually have more funds. That is, their budgets are larger. The tax base they get from the people is larger. And in many cases, you can ignore local government, but if you have children in schools, you really can't ignore schools. The second extension is we're going to consider prior performance. And in fact, the hypothesis that we're working with is that if you've been performing well and there's a budget cut, you will have more slack in terms of what the public is willing to accept. If you're performing badly going into a budget cut, they're probably going to be very restrictive of what they're willing to tolerate. And so we will artificially have these school districts perform either above or below the state average by a fair amount of performance. And 3, we're going to consider who is at fault for the shortfall. Whether it was a state budget cut, which means the local government or the agency was not at fault, or whether there was a finding of mismanagement, in which case fault could be assigned. We have a between subjects 2x2x4 design, 2 levels of performance, 2 levels of fault, though there is a default category where there's no information, and the 4 cutback strategies you saw before. We have 2 dependent variables. Both of these are factor scores, public perceptions of the performance of these agencies given these hypothetical random situations. One is a factor score just of overall effectiveness, of how effective the school district is at its core tasks. And the other is a factor score of the view of the agency in terms of budgeting and financial management. We'll call that credibility, but it's probably really budgeting financial effectiveness. These are factor scores that are forced to be orthogonal or uncorrelated with each other to try and distinguish between the 2 concepts. What we find, and this is the base set of survey results, is that there's a clear separation of overall performance from fiscal performance. On the right-hand side of this, you will see that, in fact, the only thing that matters for the assessment of performance is the actual performance. That is, high test scores result in fact, a full standard deviation improvement in the perception of the effectiveness of performance. The state budget cut or mismanagement has no impact on overall performance. Neither do any of the strategies that were used for the budget cutback. They do not relate to performance at all. So there's sort of a laser-like focus of the public on the fiscal side when there's a budget crisis. On the fiscal side, having strong past performance has a positive impact, but it's essentially trivial. It's less than 1/10 of a standard deviation, and it's going to disappear with some controls, and it's really only significant at the 0.01 level. If the budget cut came from the state, you get more credibility. They think that, in fact, you manage particularly well. However, if it's mismanagement, as you might expect, it's a dramatic drop in your credibility. And that range between the 2, between the budget cut, not your fault, and your fault, is almost as much as test scores matter in performance. Now, in terms of the categories, we left tax increases as the excluded category, thinking that the last thing people would want to do is increase taxes. We were, of course, wrong here because that would be categorized as effectively zero. And in fact, in schools, the key thing that people wanted to protect was personnel. They were opposed to cutting personnel. They were quite happy to cut capital spending, and contracting and taxes were in a middle category. If you look at the replication differences, it's most clear if, in fact, you simply look at the rank order and you see the movement of taxes from being the least preferred to essentially being the second most preferred strategy for a school district. There's clearly more fiscal slack for a school district than there is for a general purpose local government. The other was to interact whether your past performance helped you at all in terms of the crisis itself, in terms of whether it's a budget cut or mismanagement, and then we'll follow up with a look on strategies. Again, on the prepare performance side, it's completely irrelevant. But on the fiscal credibility side, you see the following, that if you have high test scores and the budget cut was not your fault, you get a more positive glow. Now, unlike our expectation that if you had high scores and you might have gotten some slack for mismanagement, that is not the case. It's actually a negative relationship. It's not significant, but it is different from the budget cuts scenario in significance. And I think essentially this means that maybe we just think you got lucky on the high scores if you're bad at managing your budget. That is, you get some reduction in credit for that. You can see that on this graph that shows the interaction effects, and you notice on the upper level, the high performers are in fact drop off far more significantly than the low performers who come up a little bit on the process. The second set of interactions, and I'm not going to show you the table because when you start doing 3x2 interactions, the equations go all over the place. What happens in that is in terms of just overall performance, that's all that matters. Notice each of the strategies cluster tightly, and they're very high if you're looking at overall performance and you had good test scores, and very low if you're looking at overall performance and you had low test scores. What is more interesting is its impact on fiscal management. Here you see clear spread. And particularly on the high performance, which is on the left, you see that in fact the spread of these options is in fact larger for the high performers than it is for the low performers. It's also the case that you're most likely to see, if you look at the middle category on the left-hand side, the cuts to personnel really separate from everything else, where in fact individuals are willing to accept almost anything but cuts in personnel and still give you credit for good fiscal management. So we think what it shows is it gives you a little bit more discretion in those types of categories and a little bit more range. But in fact, for the most part, your performance initially overall is not going to help you if you mess up on the budget. But so what? First, we think public reactions to cutback management strategies for schools really are different from those in general purpose local governments. They're much more willing to raise taxes, less willing to cut personnel. Second, that outcome and fiscal performance are perceived differently. Now, we should really be honest here. How often do outcome and fiscal performance not correlate? How often is it that you actually get an organization that performs very well but has really bad fiscal management? I don't know of a lot of examples. Outcome performance, third, only modestly defects fiscal management. And good performance, fourth, creates some more separation among cutback management strategies and indicates potentially more options to take. Extensions. We think that this could be extended to other areas with some interesting results. Other functional areas, social welfare, economic development, state versus local. And what I think is probably the most promising is applying this to nonprofits. Because nonprofits have to raise a substantial portion of their own money. And if they don't have trust, they're not going to be able to do that with voluntary raising of money. The other question is, do governments actually communicate their fiscal performance? Or do they just wait for bad news? This suggests that maybe if you do have good fiscal performance, there are probably some benefits to communicating that. Other public values. We looked at two. We did not look at equity, and I can explain that because the experimental stimulus didn't work. We tried to, but designed it badly. We didn't look at participation, either in the cutback process or as programs that get to be cut. You could also expand this to core versus auxiliary functions. I suspect for cities, if they're dealing with streets and repair versus recreation, there'll be a difference. For education, if they're dealing with core education functions versus extracurricular community outreach, I suspect there'd be a difference. I think, in fact, it would also be good to try and figure out how to move this from being incremental actions of cutback management to strategic budget decision-making. So thank you, and I will stop the shares. And we are back to the group. So as moderator, I'm going to ask anybody in the audience to just raise their hand function if they would like to ask a question. And if it's going to be a little bit slow to raise hand functions, just turn on your mic and join in. Dr. Amadi, you're on mute, by the way.
Thank you. Boy, so many presentations. I'm trying to keep up with them, but I want to go back to the first one, which was talking about women in the workplace, in intersectionality. And I was just curious about whether the women that you interviewed were the only women, Black women, in their agency, and whether or not, incrementally, as more Black women, this is my thesis about diversification. Diversification starts with one person, and then that second person, someone else comes in, and whether or not the kind of challenges that take place in the workplace begin to decrease when there's an additional, when there's one or more than one woman. That's my question.
Thank you for that question. Great question. And my participants, there were a range in terms of the number of other people of color, women of color in the workplaces. So some had experiences being the only, and they talked about the isolation of that. And others had the experiences of being in larger, more urban areas where there were more women of color kind of across the spectrum from leadership all the way kind of down to the bottom. And they talked about that. However, that did not mean that they didn't experience some of the same stress around feeling like they were still scrutinized.
Was it lessened?
I don't know if it was lessened. I did not look at that specifically to compare those who were in larger, more diverse areas to those who weren't. Some of them talked about working in different environments and different local governments, for example, saying, I was in one that was more diverse. Now I'm in one that's not, but they talked about having kind of the same types of experiences regardless. One thing that I did find interesting that I did not mention in the presentation is that for some of the women who were in more diverse workspaces, they then talked about kind of the intra-racial conflict that sometimes they felt with other Black women, specifically sometimes also Black men. And so I thought that that was an interesting element that came out in the more diverse environments where there were more women of color, Black women. So then there was this additional element of you're not the only, but it almost created an environment of competition and feeling the need to then compete with each other because there were more, but it still wasn't enough, if that makes sense.
I have another question.
Go ahead.
Great. Okay. It was the presentation on the teachers and the street level bureaucracy, that presentation. So I kind of got a little lost there because it seems as though you were looking at two different groups. When I think of the street level bureaucracy, I think of policemen. When I think of teachers, I think of something different, even though both of them operate within the context of discretion. But I wasn't sure whether the results that you had, maybe I was not know for something, but whether the results that you were coming up with was for each individually or for them combined. Could you clarify that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Yeah, so my study proceeded in kind of two stages. First, it was understanding how the amount of discretion that individual teachers experience influences, certain variables that could then impact organizational performance or school performance. Those two variables are job satisfaction and discretion. And so what I did was, I analyzed how the amount of discretion that teachers experienced or perceived impacted those two variables, and then used aggregate data for their specific schools to see if that had an impact on the aggregate school performance. So same teachers, the teachers are linked to the schools, two separate analyses, one at the individual level and then one at the organizational level.
I got you. So it really, the idea of the street level bureaucrat in terms of the other kinds of professions, that wasn't really the focus of your study.
Yeah, so I was just focusing on specifically teachers as street level bureaucrats, right? So the idea that, teachers in a sense are operating similarly to other street level bureaucrats and that they're implementing policy. In that instance, for teachers, the policy is the curriculum. And obviously teachers have a high degree of discretion when it comes to teaching methods, classroom structure, classroom organization, and things of that sort that I was hypothesizing could then, lead to increased performance at the school level.
Thank you.
Let me recognize Elijah for a question.
Thank you, Dr. Meier. I want to follow up on Dr. Dickerson. The point Dr. Amity raised, I think, cuts to critical mass. But I want to follow up on, apart from critical mass and stratification, do you also, do you see, and I'm blanking out of the question I'm asking, agency type, all right? Because we know that different agencies socialize employees differently. If an agency, a local government agency that really emphasizes, say, representation and things like that, the experience for minorities will be different from a local government area that really emphasizes more a stringent bureaucratic role than representation. So can you talk a little bit about the background of the people you interviewed, which areas were they working, and will that play a role?
So I will say that I think both, thank you for the question. I think both of these questions go to areas in which this research could be extended. So in my pool of participants, I had 38 women from across the state of North Carolina, primarily working in local governments, but different local governments for the most part. And so as part of my analysis, I did not kind of break that down into which types of local governments, what were their local governments emphasizing in terms of representation or how much diversity were in those local governments. I did not go beyond the way that they talked about it and using their own words and analyzing that to do additional research around the demographics of each place that they came from. So I think that could be a really interesting extension of this work. Having said that, one of the things that did come out in the focus groups was that some of the women who were in the more progressive areas of the state and the more progressive areas of North Carolina, where their local governments had begun embedding equity work, that didn't necessarily mean that they didn't share these same experiences. So I think similarly to the critical mass compositional diversity question, having local government who said it's focused on equity, some of them talked about, performing equity, feeling like they were a token and kind of between the community and the local government that they were employed by. So I think that there are many different areas that this could be expanded into, but I'm not sure that based on what they said and what I know about the local governments they were representing, that being in a more diverse local government or one that said it's centering and working on equity, that didn't necessarily translate into, I don't experience these struggles, or I can't relate to still feeling like I'm being scrutinized.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I will exercise the moderator's prerogative. Actually, I'll recognize Heather Wyatt-Nickel.
Hello, apologies. Let me lower my hand here. These are wonderful presentations, and I'm reminiscing of an article I still use in classes sometimes, and this goes back to you, Dr. Meier. It was Ode to Luther Gulick. When you use the old TOS scores, I believe. Yeah, I used to live in Texas as well. But I have a couple of questions, or really just comments. These were all really excellent presentations. With respect, Miss Dickerson, Dr. Dickerson, I think your point is well taken, what you said just now. You could come here to Baltimore and you might see the same results. And I would be interested, to see this study replicated in the future with Black mayors, Black SAOs, right? Women in local government across the board. So kudos. And I had two comments with respect to the piece on education. One was, I'm not sure if I read it right or heard it right, but was it that teachers had greater perceived discretion than actual discretion, right? Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So in the sample that I had drawn from, teachers perceived, or rather I should put it this way, their perceptions of the discretion that they had was a lot more important when it comes to things like their job satisfaction or their willingness or desire to collaborate with other teachers than it was their objective discretion. Part of that could be that it was a cross-national study. So obviously we're dealing with a wide range of different types of structural education systems, right? So some systems, when we talk about like, on the Asian continent, a lot of systems there are highly centrally structuralized. So teachers don't have a lot of authority to say choose textbooks or choose curriculum. So I think it becomes a little bit more important where they say, well, I don't have the ability to do these things, but I feel as though my school administrator, principal, whoever that may be, has faith in me as a professional to do and execute my job on a daily basis.
Well, that's my second question on you. And that comes, you mentioned the textbooks, right? And so here in the US, Dr. Rosenbaum this morning opened up with the fact of what's going on in Florida. And, you start to see greater rolling back of, I say, discretion in textbook selection for teachers. K-12, not so much anyway, to begin with, but you're starting to see it higher ed now. So.
Yeah, absolutely, certainly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we have, it looks like 8 minutes left or slightly less. I want to make a couple of suggestions to people. Dr. Brown, I actually find your puzzling relationship very understanding. that with retirements, those high skill, high intensity organizations and knowledge sharing get better. I suspect it's because they've consumed all the knowledge of the people who are retiring, and this is new blood coming in. And so you might want to think about this knowledge sharing as really just a process that goes on, and that it has to be replenished and fed every once in a while over time. And that explains why this creates really, I think, a virtuous circle in terms of what you found. If I might keep the floor for a little bit, I do want to comment on Dr. Dickerson's study, which I find just spectacular. Okay. I am of a firm belief that the only way we will ever understand intersectionality is with good qualitative research. And this is from a quantitative research. I know how far I can go, and I can't go beyond that. Here is what I think is the sort of things that puzzle me, which is among these Black women, they're Black women executives, they've got a bunch of other identities, right? They have professions. They have a set of lived experiences that come together. They have their educational background. They have their family, right? And at this point, as I like to say, we need theory here to sort of understand when these things happen. I can't put my hand on it now, but there is an excellent qualitative study of federal science managers who are Black and female, done by a professor in the School of Education at the University of Maryland. And the dominance of that science identity for these women was just incredible, right? In terms of how much time they were thinking that way versus how much time they were thinking other ways. And that sort of shapes all of these things. And that's why I think you can only do this qualitatively. And it's just truly a compliment. I love what you're doing, and I hope you continue to push it. This code switching, I'd like you to comment on a little bit more, because this is new. Okay, I'm sort of interested in how they do this.
Sure. Thank you for that feedback. I do think there are a lot of ways that I could have analyzed these data differently, grouping the women by the type of organization that they work in or the area of the state. And so that's something that I will consider for the future. In terms of code switching, that is a relatively new, it's been around in psychology, I think, and also in the private sector literature a little bit more than it has been in the public sector. And what it refers to is essentially changing mannerisms, like it stems out of language. So shifting language, depending on the people you're with and the context that you're in. And so in my study, one of the topics we talked about was being authentic in the workplace. And one of the things that came up is this idea of, I might be a certain way when I'm in the community, right? I might use a certain language when I'm talking with people in the community, in the Black community. And then when I enter the workspace, I'm going to talk differently. A couple of women actually talked about having like bass in their voice. So the tone of voice they're using, the way that they're talking, and how they manage that and navigate that and change that to be responsive to the different contexts that they're in. So recognizing that the context shifts, they shift themselves accordingly. Another related topic is hair and hairstyles. And that was not a specific area of exploration for my research, but it came up. So the idea of, I think about, which hairstyle am I wearing? Do I need to change my hair based on the environment that I'm in? Is my natural hair accepted? Or should I straighten my hair today? Or when I walk into the workplace, as another way of code switching. So there are a number of different ways that women are navigating and negotiating the spaces that they're in.
We have 3 minutes left. If no one else wishes to say something, I've got one more suggestion for Lawrence Brown, which is, I was struck that retirements are really a special case of turnover.
Yes.
And in fact, at least I've seen Sing Ho An has been doing some work on voluntary versus involuntary turnover, and the sort of real disadvantage of one versus the other. I suspect that on a retirement system, it might work the same way, but I think maybe you have an interaction effect there because you have this knowledge sharing variable that, you know, adjusts the costs and benefits of those two types of retirements.
Right, right. Yes, and then, you know, to an earlier point that you made, and also to a comment that I see in the chat here, one incredibly important salient control variable was involuntary, I know, separations and voluntary exits. One of my control variables is basically firing, like disciplinary removal. And we find that is positively associated with perceptions of work unit skill, which bears out in literature, but it's interesting to see that I'm finding that as well.
Well, let me thank the panelists. This was a very enlightening panel with good quality research. I hope to see it all in print. And thank you for participating in COMPA 23. And we will be timed out now. And so please join the other sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.